Morning, everyone in the West Coast. Good afternoon, everyone in the East Coast. And good evening, everyone in Europe and the Middle East, North Africa, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association's What's Up in Ottoman and Turkish Studies series. Today's meeting will be focusing on, and let me share our poster with you, Chasing the Ottoman Early Modern, which was a special dossier published in the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association in the spring of 2020. And I will first introduce a board member of OTSA. What I try to do at these meetings is to introduce you to people who serve the association in different ways. And today's board member to be introduced is Giancarlo Casale. Before I introduce him, I just want to say a few things. There will be a very long message you'll be receiving from me later today or early tomorrow about OTSA news. So I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about that. But someone is with us, the president of the Middle East Studies Association, because she happens to be also a member of OTSA, our dear colleague, Dina Khoury. And I'd like to just take a moment to thank her for all of her support to us. Our last event, the event on Boğaziçi, was co-sponsored by MESA. MESA's Committee on Academic Freedom has been paying so much attention to Turkey, and she was very supportive. And MESA board issued a statement on the events going on at Boğaziçi, which also was very much welcomed by our colleagues in Turkey. And that statement was also endorsed by American Anthropological Association, American Historical Association, American Philosophical Association, American Sociological Association, Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, International Society for Third Sector Research. And American Political Science Association shared the event that we did on Boğaziçi, the panel, via their social media platforms. If you missed the panel, it's available on our YouTube channel. I would encourage you to have a look at it. And that will be it for organizational news. Oh, actually, I was also going to say something on the MESA Global Academy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the link for applications via chat while our meeting is going on, so that our colleagues who are in positions, precarious positions, without jobs in the region could apply and maybe receive some support from MESA. Okay, Giancarlo Casale is currently on a 5-year appointment as chair of Mediterranean history at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, although his permanent home is at the University of Minnesota. His recent publications include the article, Did Alexander the Great Discover America?, awarded the 2020 Nelson Prize from the Renaissance Society of America, as well as an English translation of Temeshvarlı Osman Ağa''s Prisoner of the Infidels, appearing this spring from the University of California Press. Giancarlo, he is also one of the funniest Ottomanists you'll ever meet. I am so proud that he is a board member of our association. Please, Giancarlo, go ahead, please take the lead.
Okay, thank you very much, Baki. So I have a strange responsibility this evening for me, which is that Baki has just introduced me so that I can introduce our 3 co-moderators so that the 3 of them eventually can introduce me. So I haven't had exactly this experience before, but let's just get right to it. So without further ado, let me introduce our 3 co-moderators for this evening's session, beginning with Virginia Aksan, who on my Zoom screen is immediately below me. She is, I'm sure most of you, almost all of you probably already know, she's Professor Emeritus from the Department of History at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. But this is directly from her. She has decided she will not go quietly and has been making a nuisance of herself wherever she can. She has just finished the second edition of her Ottoman Wars for Rutledge, radically revised and now called The Ottomans, 1700 to 1918, an Empire Besieged. I'm very excited to see this new and radically revised version, Professor Aksan. Second in our distinguished panel of moderators is Antonis Kiriakou, who teaches Ottoman and Turkish history at Pantheon University in Athens, as well as being an affiliated researcher at Stanford University, where he is co-directing the Mapping Ottoman Epirus project, together with Ali Yaicioğlu, one of our presenters later this evening. He has two forthcoming books, both in Greek: Continental Island, Space, Environment, and Economy in Cyprus During the Age of Revolutions, and Winning at Land, Losing at Sea, The First Turkish History of the Greek Revolution. Two more reasons, I might add, why I wish I knew Greek. So maybe I'll eventually do something about that. Finally, our third member of our distinguished moderating panel is Professor Boğaç Ergene. He is a professor of history at the University of Vermont, although this semester he's teaching at Middle East Technical University as a visiting professor in Ankara. And he is the author of a intimidating list of books, including Local Court, Provincial Society, and Justice in the Ottoman Empire, co-author of The Economics of Ottoman Justice, and most recently, Halal Food, A History. He is currently working on yet another book, Corruption in the Ottoman Empire. And I think for the moment, my work is done. I will turn the panel over to the three of you.
Thank you, Giancarlo, and I'll be saying a few words on behalf of the co-editors of the special dossier. I'll be giving a little bit of a background of how the whole thing started. And really it was when Boğaç put a Facebook comment back when he was still on Facebook in 2016, throwing an idea for a Mesa panel on early modernity. And I was one of the first people, I think, or perhaps even the first one to respond. And we started talking about it. And eventually we submitted a proposal for a thematic discussion for the 2017 MESA meeting, where we had a very exciting and fruitful discussion with many of the people who eventually contributed to the dossier. To the special dossier, and then Ginny joined in a little bit later, and we started talking about the various themes, how we would organize such an endeavor. We had some discussions with Kent Schall and with Nükhet Varlık at ODSA about how to, the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, about how to put this thing together. And that's how everything developed. For the further details, you can read Ginny's introduction to the collection itself. Now, I'll say very briefly a few thoughts about my own personal thoughts about this collection and my own contribution as well. What comes to mind when we're thinking back to these things is, what would I have done differently in hindsight? And I think one issue that comes to mind is that I would have liked to have some more regional representation of areas of expertise. We have a very broad geography in the Ottoman world, and to have more representation would also be to move away from an area studies kind of logic of sort of special entities like, Arab studies or Arab land, but on different spatial units and scales like the Mediterranean, Greater Syria, the Black Sea, etc. I would have liked some broader sub-disciplinary representation. Most contributions in my reading have a heavy inclination to intellectual, cultural, or political history. But it would be interesting to see how a historian of science or medicine would find the periodization of early modern. And apart from Marinos' strong grounding of intellectual cultural history on social history, the remaining contributions are mainly concerned with the realm of ideas and concepts. And finally, a few words about my own contribution and how I react to the perception of others. And if there is one thing that I would regret, it's that I did not accurately articulate what I had in mind, namely that early modern can be useful only to the degree and according to the way that historians provide content to an analytical tool that is otherwise not self-explanatory or evident. Some of the reactions to my contribution took it to be a rejection or an expression of skepticism about the value of this temporal analytical unit. My own understanding is that the value of the category corresponds to the value historians attach to it. And this is something that needs to be clearly and explicitly articulated. It's not so much about which analytical tools we use, but rather how we use them and for what purpose. And with these thoughts, I'd like to pass the chair to Watch, who will be giving his own sharing his own ideas about the.
Thank you so much for this, Antonis. If you don't mind, actually, I will just invite Ginny to comment, and I will follow her. That was the arrangement. Ginny, would you like to do that?
Yes, I would. Do we know how many of our contributors are actually with us?
Let's see.
Baki, you're on mute.
Probably more than 10, I would say. Some people were having trouble entering, but I think they did.
I think I see even Marinos.
Heather Ferguson was not able gonna be here.
All right, let's assume we have 10 or
more than
12.
10.
We hope this session is a conversation. So I have been designated the timekeeper, and I have a little creature that shows up. So if this appears in my screen, when you're talking, it means, well, maybe it's time to wrap up and let somebody else do it. We're also asking contributors to introduce themselves before you say something the first time, and hope we can move quickly through some of these ideas. So for me, I'm early modern. I've left behind somewhat in question of periodization altogether. My skepticism grew. It isn't that it's not useful. It's simply, I think, the way in which the field has expanded to extraordinary subjects, it has less application in terms of actual dates. So I choose to use some linguistic ideas around it, and they're partly driven by the fact that I've had 1 of 2 cataract surgeries, so I can see long, but can't see it all with this one. So the first category is fuzzy to clear. And I like to think of the early modern as bringing some clarity to the way global economies ran. The second one is occupier to occupied. And this is about the collapse of the military system in the 18th century for me. As you know, that's what I write about. The third one is about predator to prey. And this is because I'm a bird watcher, but also because I think it does become, the Ottoman Empire becomes a prey to the entire colonial system of the world after a certain point, and maybe we can find the date that happens. And finally, I think we see myths dissolving in the front of invented tradition. Thank you, where is he? Beshara, who uses that in his critique. The invented tradition for me here is the colonial Westphalian system, inevitably or ineluctably, however, Christian. So it's those three things: fuzzy to clear, occupier to occupier, predator to prey, myth to invented tradition. I will go a little further in anybody who wants to ask me about that. And the other thing I think that is universal and still is universal all over the Middle East is migration and movement. And we cannot lose sight of how difficult that is to put together. So I will leave it there. And as I said, it's up to Fawad to continue. And I hope we have a great conversation.
So there's a reason that Ginny was supposed to speak second and I was supposed to speak third. She was going to say that everything that we discuss is irrelevant, and I was going to make the argument that everything is irrelevant to what we do. So she obviously changed her mind. I am, in a spot at this point. I have to come up with new things to say. So here it goes. I've been scrambling since this morning what to say, smart things to find, to reflect on it, and to be able to find things to kind of, intelligent things to say. I've been reading and rereading some of these contributions. And I looked at Beshara's piece and I looked at Joanna Innes's piece. Both of them are brilliant pieces. And one of the things that Beshara says there is really interesting, stuck by me. He says in his commentary, he says that the hegemony of the early modern is deeply rooted. So I've been here in Turkey for about, 4 or 5 months there. Not in Turkey, Beshara. Nobody talks about early modern in Turkey, which says something about how Ottoman history is written in 2 separate zones, and who writes Ottoman history and how people write their histories. And there is something about, that distinction that needs exploration. I will come back to this issue, I think. And the second thing that comes to me, because I'm scrambling, that scrambling itself is an observation. The notion, since we sent the dossier to the journal, Jotza, has been irrelevant to me. Now I'm taking, Ginny's position. It has been irrelevant in my research, right? Whatever you call it, early modern or the modernity, Beshara makes it, emphasizes that distinction is an important one. But I found myself not thinking about this, right? It's almost now, I think about it, it appears as a filter. The notion itself and everything that goes about this filter that blurs more than it clarifies the ways we think about this past. And by talking about that filters, it's almost like that, cat filter on Zoom that one of those Texan, attorneys use in a Zoom meeting, right? In a trial, and imposed on his own view, and he's yelling at the judge, "I'm not a cat, I'm not a cat." So there is that. There is a blurring aspect to that too. So I'm not going to deny the practical aspects of it, the pedagogical aspects of it. When you are teaching in a European institution or American institution, the notion has an obvious relevance. But in terms of research, for someone like me, for someone with my interests, and mind you, I'm preparing a course now that I haven't taught before at Middle East Technical University, Political Economy of Ottoman Empire. It has no relevance whatsoever, at least in the way that the notion is used in the Ottoman context. Joanna Innes's notion, essay is really important. She discusses how that notion appeared in European history writing and how it seems to her adopted by the Ottomans, and she identifies all these ways in which Ottomans kind of utilize that term. And the ways that Ottomans utilize the notion or the early modern or early modernity is more about, there is actually a wonderful phrase Beshara uses with reference to Antonis's piece that we find it. He says, nostalgic and depoliticizing multiculturalism. So I find myself closer to Antonis as expressed by Beshara here. You can add other things to it. For example, in the Ottoman context, emphasis on global connections, emphasis on comparative articulations, orientation in a certain way. Other forms of comparative analysis ignored in the Ottoman case is important. In Turkey, you don't find any economic historian who utilize that term. What does that mean? You don't find many legal historians, people like myself, utilize that term. What does that mean? Which makes me think that the notion has a certain provincial quality. It is popular in certain fields, and Antonis mentioned this, in his preamble, when he was introducing this discussion to us, right? Our dossier is kind of overrepresented by historians of intellectual kind of a world, essentially, or political world. So in a sense, I will finish it here. That provincialism bothers me. And in a way, the fact that it has become in Europe, in the United States, early modern so popular, what does that mean about the ways in which we write Ottoman history outside of Turkey and many other Middle Eastern contexts. Sorry, Virginie.
You're going to talk about the chat? Unmute.
Here's the organization. Antonis will be moderating the discussion on screen, and he'll be following the hands being raised. And I have the responsibility of moderating the comments put on the chat box. I'm going to compile them. When someone says something relevant on screen, I will notify Antonis by raising my hand and ask him to recognize me so that I can pass that information whenever it's appropriate. That's how we are going to do it. Antonis will be moderating on screen, and I will be following and compiling comments on chat box.
And Ginny will be raising the duck whenever someone.
The duck, which I raised on watch, which I can do to my old friend. I'll try it on some.
I was testing it so that you can try it. So.
From here on in, it's sort of by volunteer, right? And we'd like those who contributed and want to say something to start first.
So
Don't
yeah,
all raise your
Baki,
hands. Antonis will have to call on somebody.
Cannot raise his hand. So
I'll go if nobody wants to go.
Giancarlo.
Yeah, Giancarlo, go ahead, please.
Yeah, what I wanted to say sort of a little bit follows up on Boğaç. It's kind of situated in the two jobs that I have, Minnesota and Florence. I'll start in Minnesota. One of the things that I do there is I edit the Journal of Early Modern History, which is the official journal of the Center of Early Modern History, which was founded in the 80s. And at the time, it was the first center dedicated to studying early modern history from a global perspective. And I'm sad to say that as of last month, it doesn't exist anymore. It was folded together with the Center for Medieval Studies, into something new called the Center for the Study of the Pre-Modern World. And of course, there are material considerations having to do with faculty members who retired and were not replaced, and moribund graduate programs. But the fact that my colleagues didn't really feel like they had to go to bat to save the Center for Early Modern History, I think speaks to maybe a kind of loss of interest in the category, which I think is reflected quite clearly in a lot of the contributions to this essay. Although I have to say, when I go back to Minnesota and I can no longer, as an Ottoman historian, be part of the faculty of early modern historians, but will instead be among the historians of the pre-modern world, is that a step ahead? I'm not so sure about that. So that brings me to my second comment, which is in Italy. I mean, some of you listening know this better than me. There isn't such a thing really as early modern history. There's just modern history. Modern history starts kind of at the end of the 14th century and it goes to the end of the 18th century. And then after that, you have contemporary history. So if we were having this conversation in Italian, it would be a completely different conversation, because all of the angst about how early modernity implies, the nation state and biopolitics and colonial forms of knowledge isn't really operative at all. Modernity is something that comes before all of that. So, I think a lot of historians in Italy would be very confused by the question, is 16th century Venice modern? Sort of by definition, it's modern. So from that perspective, for somebody like me, knowing as I do that the Ottoman Mediterranean, before it was the Ottoman Mediterranean, much of it was Italian and therefore by definition modern, and that Italy borders the Ottoman Empire. Well then, if I'm denying the modernity of the Ottoman Empire, that means that when I cross the border from the Venetian Dalmatia into the Ottoman Balkans in the 16th century, I'm crossing from the modern world into the non-modern world or the pre-modern world. That's an absurd assertion. So for me, the work of early modern is not at all about connecting directly the 16th and 17th Ottoman Empire with now. It's about insisting that the Ottoman Empire of the 16th and 17th century doesn't exist temporally in some other time from the societies that surround it. And I think that's it's something that I would sort of insist on, actually.
Thank you, Giancarlo, and a very efficient timekeeping function from Ginny, and thank you for sticking to the time. Anyone else from our authors? Selim Hocam.
Unmute.
You could unmute.
I still do it after so many months. Yes, I mean, what Giancarlo said is interesting, and all the essays were having different perspectives. I felt a bit lonely as a literary scholar who is more interested in subject positions and maybe a bit stuck with kind of post-structural critique of evidence-based objectivity, which kind of not involved much periodization as a focus, but rather textual, loops of textual production, kind of strange loops that may take us back to ancient Egypt, to Abbasid, like Ottomans were able to travel through their texts to many places, defying any sort of course, the development of media is another thing. What was kind of in the essays, I really enjoyed reading them, kind of a gap was about environmental history, which had entered Ottoman studies gloriously through a couple of studies. And I think it may bring a different perspective to periodization, because it is under the sign of what is called Anthropocene, and which is kind of bringing a critique, an original critique of modernity as a concept. So consequently, early modern as well, I guess, because I can't think early modern without falling into the black hole of modernity. As a literary scholar, thinking about genres and their transformations always invites this Western influence, fear of it, etc. One thing I think, going back to the textual sources and their persistence, perpetuity, which makes to somewhat like history possible, like along with other textual science, of course, architecture, sartorial remains, etc. I think like Dina's article was very interesting for me, because I kind of overblown her distinction of region and province, and I was thinking like, how can we imagine Ottoman Empire as a region instead of an empire or a province of a global world, but I mean constantly like an organic part of a human experience, as much as its tentacles can reach, which may be farther than we may imagine. And then I was thinking about media theory, which talks about, like all these came to me through reading all these essays. In fact, like thinking about empire, like empires and their growth in what we call early modern, unrelated with modernity, but more like organic developments, like micro models, like centers holding and infecting other centers. Then linguistic evidence or sartorial, any signification becomes a defense system almost, because they put barriers like the language difference, etc. I don't know. These are some inspirations I get from reading the articles. Thank you.
Thank you, Selim. Baki has already indicated that you would like to say something, so please go ahead.
Sure. I am going to join Giancarlo, I think, in insisting that the early modern matters, mainly to say was from Orientalist approaches that might inadvertently. I'm not suggesting that people who are against early modern are being Orientalist. That's not at all. But inadvertently, if we deny something that's happening to the west of the Ottoman Empire, to the Ottomans, we find ourselves somewhat in a bind that the Ottomans are somehow so different and so unique, which from one perspective might put them in a high pedestal, but from a different perspective, might put them in sort of like a, you know, not quite like the people who were going ahead perspective. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then I received a question from an undergraduate student in Turkey via email. It was not to the general WhatsApp account. So I think the question was directed to me. So I'm going to read the question and then say a few things. This student says, some historians claim that Westernization and modernization are separate things. Apart from, he refers to Dana Secdi. Apart from Secdi's claim, the concept of modernity we use for the Ottoman Empire is an act of Westernization or not, but ultimately a concept that belongs to the development of the West. How acts of modernity in the pre-colonial period can be attributed to the Ottomans? Because as Andre Günder Frank claimed, Europe did not have a dominating power in the pre-1800 era. I mean, how can we use Western modernity without taking it from the West? Or is it early modernity, not Western? Do the acts of democratization, confessionalization, bureaucratization, etc. belong to early modernity, or are they specific processes that later joined the Ottoman to the Ottoman modernization with Tanzimat? I think this question speaks to, maybe it's not as well formulated, but to the heart of several issues that make this discussion all the more relevant today. I don't know how many of you are following what is going on in Turkey these days, but there is a sort of conscious effort to put the last 200 years of Turkish history and Ottoman and Turkish history, sort of take that out of circulation as if that history was not ours, that history only came from outside, doesn't belong to us. All those developments that happened in the last 200 years imposed on us from outside. And we have somehow an original history that we can go back to before those 200 years. This argument is sort of pushing for a language and discourse, anti-Western discourse, and in a sense, anti-modern, although it is very modern. In order to respond to that argument, we need to be able to show that some of the developments that are so closely associated with modernity were born in the early modern era. Right in the passage, in the transition from early modern and modern, perhaps some people changed gears and certain things started developing a little faster in some part of the world than the other. But I think if we lose this heuristic device of the early modern, it's going to be difficult to show that the world we live in, we made it all together in one way or another. And in thinking about how that gear changed and things started getting faster in some parts of the world. So maybe the slight disjuncture between early modern and modern, I think we could think about colonialism and capitalism as certain markers of the modern as opposed to the early modern, and think of early modern as the period in which hierarchies were challenged from all sides. So the challenge to the hierarchies of social hierarchies that comes with monetization and social mobility is what marks the early modern. And then the modern moves perhaps faster with the addition of colonialism and capitalism to the mix. That might be a way to look at it. I am running out of time. I think Jeannie showed me her umbrella. So I'm going to shut up right
about
here.
7 minutes ago.
Yeah. Thank you, Baki. Joanna raised her hand, and if I can also ask you to say, to introduce yourself to the audience.
Yes, so I'm a historian of Britain. I'm a complete amateur in Ottoman history, but I became interested in it when I was editing a book on the Mediterranean. I thought in order to edit this book, I have to know something about Ottoman history. And then I was interested in what I read and in the Ottoman historians that I met. So I've retained an interest. So I wanted also to pick up on what Giancarlo said on one of the arguments that recurs in the contributions about the advantages of using early modern, that is to establish simultaneity, to not talk as if different parts of Europe, the Mediterranean, are in different time zones. And I'm very much in favor of that. But I'm also in favor of mixing up Ottoman history and European history more, not saying the West is modern, what is the Ottomans? How do the Ottomans relate to this thing called the West? Because the West is very fragmented, differentiated, itself has many different kinds of experience. And I think it would be more fruitful to think of process change sometimes imposed, experiences imposed from the outside being shared across this space. So those experiences of domination and forced change, there are interesting parallels to explore between Ottoman experience of those things and other European experiences of those things. Of course, it's difficult to tell people already grappling with Ottoman history, please grapple with all of European history as well. But I think conversations between Ottomanists and Europeanists around these issues could be very fruitful.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Dina Khoury is raising her hand, please.
Hello, I actually want to address a couple of issues that have come up in this discussion. This meeting takes place exactly a week after I'd given a talk at the University of Mosul in Arabic as to how Mosul's Ottoman past can help rebuild the history of its present. And it sort of unscrambles completely to me and to Moslawis what is modern, what's early modern. And it also highlights the issue of forms of regional patriotism that have been deployed in places where the post-colonial state has either been dismantled or completely destroyed, in terms of what temporality means and what region, how varied the regions of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire spatially is the Mediterranean, but it also is on the edges of the Indian Ocean, as and so there are different temporalities. And I think what I've always tried to struggle with is the role of space in shaping temporality and its critical importance in the way we think about time, because it's layered. It's very layered, and there are several keys in which we can understand time, and we need to be open to it. And there's another point that I struggle with as a social historian, because this is how I see myself. And this was brought up by a couple of contributions, one in law and one in social history. When you're dealing with social history, it seems to me as a social historian, there's this puzzle. How do we situate different rhythms of lives, different life worlds in the grand narrative of time that we call early modernity or whatever we decide to use as a description that will allow us to talk to one another and to others as historians who are not necessarily doing history in this region. So that's sort of a conundrum, I think, that defines our entry into the idea of trying to shape what we talk about in terms of time.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I think your contribution brought in the space question very prominently, and I think it was something that was very valuable, and indeed we could have done with more aspects of this issue. Anyone else who would like to? Beshara, Doumani, please, and then Nir. If you could unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me into this family. I do speak a little bit from the margins. Just a couple of quick comments about how Indigenous studies may be useful to our discussion here. One is the question of the politics of recognition. So if we cross the Adriatic and we insist that we are actually belong to that period of time called modern, we are in many ways asking to be assimilated into something that oppresses us in the first place. So this is the question that Native peoples are facing all over the world. What does it mean to be recognized as belonging to the time that was assigned in a way by the colonial encounter to begin with? And the other thing from indigenous studies, maybe from the work of Mark Rifkin, who talks about beyond settler colonial time, is the issue of how temporalities are arenas of contestation all the time. And there is not a single temporality in which we all operate. So I think these two insights may be useful to the discussion here. I must maybe add that the Holy Trinity for historians anyway is this articulation or architecture, narrative architecture of time, space, and actor, right? And the ways we configure this Holy Trinity in telling stories is an act, I think in many ways, of participating in larger forces of power relations. Historians, I think, are not the only ones producing history here. I think Baki's point about how public discourse in Turkey is focusing on the last 200 years being something that has gone wrong, as opposed to an authentic period that existed before, is exactly the Orientalist idea, but on the other side of the coin. That is to say, there's a rupture about 200 years ago, 1798, and either things went really well and produced and a kind of a homogeneous linear time of progress, or it's just a complete destruction of a morally centered legal Islamic universe that deserves to have a real say in remaking of the world as we exist. But both depend on the same exact notion of rupture in this encounter with to make their case.
Thank you. Nir?
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to essentially just explain my piece a bit and give some context to it. I think I'm the youngest member of this panel, or at least in terms of academic years. And I think that influenced my perspective. So just to introduce myself, I'm a relatively new assistant professor at the University of California in San Diego. I teach early modern Ottoman history, focus on history of communication, reading, writing, history of science. And I wasn't part of the original panel that started this whole thing. And I was invited by Antonis to write something. And I never actually, I didn't know what other people were going to write, but I figured that most of the other people were going to be relatively for the usage of the term early modern. And so as a sort of provocation or as a way, a think piece, do the best thing a think piece could, I took the opposite stance, which is I argued against the use of early modernity. And a lot of this comes out of my moment in, I guess, my graduate training or my own intellectual formation. So I started my PhD in 2008, I finished 2016. So it was kind of right at the high point of when people were most acutely interested in using the term early modern and integrating the Ottoman Empire into a global early modernity. And I did this for a lot of my research. I work on what I call cheap manuscript pamphlets, rasail, and how they created new communities, how they, in many ways, mirrored a lot of the transformations that we find in print culture in Europe and so forth. And for much of my dissertation work on intellectual history, I tried to show that the Ottomans had an equivalent modernity, that they were on the same temporal world as early modern Europeans, and we can speak about them in the same way, and we can even connect them in certain moments, in certain ways. And ultimately, I started becoming increasingly bored with this conception, and I found it one difficult to keep utilizing because, for example, when I turned to, I don't know, Mamluk history or whatever preceded me, Abbasid history, I found very similar mechanisms and processes occurring. And then I would always have to say, well, what makes this Ottoman thing, this Ottoman pamphlets or this Ottoman reading culture so different from that? And I had to turn to something other than just saying, well, it's all part of, you know, early modernity, some global wave. And I know that's a very specific vision of what early modernity is, but that's what I was working with. And ultimately, I found that the concept of early modernity is, there's nothing wrong with it. I think as a heuristic device, it's absolutely crucial, as Baki pointed out and as Giancarlo pointed out. And I like to use it, and I think we should all keep using it. I just think that it's no longer generative of ideas in the same way that it was perhaps in the 1990s or in the early 2000s. And I think concepts are only worth their weight if they lead us to think in new ways. And so in my piece, I ultimately turned to a different set of ideas, a different set of concepts about what we call temporality or periodization. And that's the work of people that engage with archaeology, people like Dan Smale in his Deep History, and also Ian Hodder, who's a post-processual archaeologist. And I find them generative of new ideas, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Nir. Güneş indicated he wanted to speak, and then Marinos.
Well, I would just like to, since we are talking about temporalities, just give an example of the clock towers. So it can, perhaps from the clock towers, we can have an idea of what is Ottoman Empire, because for early modernity, I think there is not, we can discuss if it is an empty signifier or it doesn't signify anything for the Ottomans, etc. It's something else. But Ottoman Empire as well, when it's linked to a temporal or conceptual or spatial entity, then we always, I think I always ask, what is the Ottoman Empire? And for the clock towers, it's something, because when it's the Giancarlo's example, when we cross the border from Italian lands in the Dalmatia and enter to the Ottoman zone, we still see the clock towers in many lands, in many cities, in Ottoman Croatia, Ottoman Bosnia, and Ottoman Serbia, in Ottoman Hungary as well. But then, when we get into the Rumelia, in Rumeli, these clock towers end. And it's only in the end of the 19th or at the turn of the 20th century that the clock towers are built across the Ottoman Empire. So in the Ottoman, so if there are, okay, we can discuss the early modernities, but Ottoman lands are a patchwork as well. So they have their own temporalities, early, regular, late modernity, not late modernity, but they have their own rhythms of modernity. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well. That's what I would like to add.
Thank you, Güneş. Marino?
Yeah, well, Güneş helps me to formulate my comment a bit different that I had planned, because the clock towers and the use of time is a nice example and a touchstone for such concepts. Because the thing is that, yes, there are not only clock towers, there are also watches, and there is also a very different, a very marked presence of watches and of counting the time precisely, which gets stronger and stronger in the 17th and of course in the 18th century. But you cannot see at all any kind of this modern mentality about time, because you cannot see this modern mentality of time in working time. So my original comment would be that there are two uses of the term early modernity. Two possible uses. One is to see it as a stage of Ottoman history, with what comes before and what comes next. And the other is to see it as a means of comparison. So to situate Ottoman realities in comparison with what we call early modern Europe, especially Europe, because we don't speak so much about early modern Iran, for instance. If we choose to, or if we prefer, if we tend to use early modernity as a stage of Ottoman history, then we have to ask why to use it. Because if you use early modernity, then the only, or the main reason would be to connect it with a modernity, but that in this case should have been mainly the product of early modern mechanisms within the empire, within the Ottoman society. If we use it as a means of comparison, so to see that there are similar phenomena in different places of the earth, and especially in Western Europe and Ottoman lands at the same time, so to explain the synchronicity, then the key word is explain. We have to explain why. Because just saying that we have an early modern state or an early modern individuality or sensitivities or things in the Ottoman lands at the same time, or roughly at the same time with Western Europe, we explain nothing. It's just the same things or similar things at the same time. If we are able to find social dynamics or socio-economic dynamics working in a similar way, then we are more prone to explain these similarities. So the time and the watch and the clock towers example is nice because here we see that there are some similarities in some domains, in some sectors of Ottoman culture, but not in others. So there are procedures that in political culture, for instance, that have similarities with Europe, but not in the economic sector. So this might, okay, I have my beginnings of a theory saying that there are two different procedures. One is that there is something slowly dissolving, like a feudal society of the 15th and 16th centuries, with all the phenomena related to this monetization and disruption of hierarchies, all what Baki told us about. And there are things in what we call early modernity connected with the birth of capitalism, which, well, plainly did not happen in the Ottoman Empire, except from little, perhaps, islands. So, yeah, well, there is as a famous Greek historian had told me, modernity is this euphemism for capitalism. So then, if this is valid, then early modernity is something we couldn't use in Ottoman realities. We should say something else. But on the other hand, because we have a process that does not have a definite end, because we don't know what will happen without the global interaction with the West, which is modernity by itself. So yes, early modernity is a handy means of designating this procedure. I don't know. I feel I have confused my thoughts more than I wanted. I hope you get the point.
Thank you, Marino. You certainly stole my thunder. I wanted to raise Christos Hagiosif's argument about modernity being a euphemism for capitalism, but this is certainly something we can discuss. John Paul raised his arm earlier.
Hi, I'm John Paul Ghobrial. After all these comments, I have to confess that when I went back to look at the piece that Antonis asked us to write, I felt like a real Philistine because, you know, we were asked to write sort of analytical, intellectual, sort of history-focused pieces about early modernity. And when I read it now, I just see myself getting very worked up about curriculum reform and appointment panels and disciplinary wars between global history and Ottoman history. And I think partly, I mean, think of Giancarlo's points at the start, actually. I think for me, when I wrote this piece, it was all very relevant, the sort of bunker feel to what I was writing, because we don't write in a vacuum. And one of my main concerns about early modernity, sort of what is the point of using this term and what does it do to our field, was to think about the future of Middle Eastern studies or of Ottoman history in a world where we have maybe had to use terms to keep ourselves relevant, or maybe in spite of our actual analytical preferences. So I thought I should just say one thing to try to be less practical and less focused on the money and the teaching and the curriculums, which is just that I think actually something about reading early modern history. I find it quite useful for our field as a way of revising a sort of spectrum of the possibilities of the past. In other words, reading other early modern history in our period and using that to think about things that perhaps we haven't seen already there in our sources and in our field. For me, that's been the most useful, maybe heuristic, using early modern, the term as a heuristic tool, is to help it give me a new eyes, I guess, on our own field. So I'll try to add something not about curriculum reform and a very local view of Oxford politics, but that's the best I have, Antonis.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Boach also asked for the.
So I'm acting here in my role as one of the moderators, and I'm going to reflect on a couple of questions that I received related to comments made so far. I think in relation to Giancarlo's original comment, there's a question by Yavuz, and he might want to elaborate on that. He's bringing up the relationship between the notion modern or modernity with territory. This might have something to do with the comments of Dina made earlier. And the second question that I received is by Harun Çelik. He thanks everyone in the panel and people who have commented so far, and he asks, can the idea of early modernity be applied to different fields of study for the Ottomans? What benefits could the archaeologist or environmental historian have in viewing this period as early modern as opposed to modernity in contrast to the medieval or antique? That's the question that he asked.
Thank you, Boach. Let me take advantage of my privilege here to address both questions. I think early modernity is the idea of the early modern is extremely relevant, whether we're talking about territorialization and the formation of the modern state, or whether we're talking about environmental history. In my view, there are extremely interesting processes during the 17th and 18th century, which are crucial and really provide a bridge towards later modern conceptualizations of what territory is, what citizenship is, what homeland is, and the way that they are used and articulated in an early modern setting in our Ottoman sources are indispensable to understanding how modern conceptualizations took place. As far as environmental history is concerned, I would bring other examples of, I would connect it to the economic dimension and look at how sugar and how cotton is being cultivated. And we've had the arguments about sugarcane cultivation, not immediately relevant to the Ottomans, I suppose, more so to the Venetians, but I think it's a way in which we can see this relevance of an early modern economic system that has direct impact on the environment. And it has been argued that it was the first capitalist enterprise that was financed from abroad in the way that it was highly specialized and highly sort of specific. tasks, as far as how it was marketed in global markets, so on and so forth. So I think it's worth using early modern for both fields in that respect, as you know, as long as we can sort of ground it and make it immediately relevant to the methodological question asked by subfields of subdisciplinary fields in the way that we talked in the beginning as well. I don't know if anyone else wants to address this question. Natalie Rothman has raised her hand. I don't know if it's regarding to this particular question or if she wants to raise another question.
It's in some ways connected, but if others have more direct responses, I'm definitely happy to wait.
I don't see anyone responding, so please go ahead, Natalie.
Thanks. And so I want to address a slightly different angle here than what's been raised so far, which is thinking about the early modern more as a heuristic, not that is not only or even primarily useful for comparison. That is, do we have clock towers or not? Do we have forms of governmentality that we see in Europe at the time or not? But rather for insisting on kind of the inherent entanglement of all parts of the world as an a priori, especially, although not only in this period, I think as a way of getting past the very important impasse that Beshara put in front of us. That is, how do we overcome the kind of the totalizing claims of settler colonial epistemologies and allow for multiple temporalities, but not in ways that kind of reassert radical alterity as the only way of understanding the processes that we study. And what I mean by that is that, to me, part of the appeal of early modern as a moniker, and again, notwithstanding the very legitimate critiques that have been raised already, is that it really allows us to question the very distinction between Ottoman and the West and the civilizational assumptions that kind of underwrite so much of the rhetoric around Western modernity. So to me, the value is not only insisting that one cannot understand the Ottoman Empire of the 16th and 17th centuries apart from these extensive webs of relations with other regions. And here I would say it's definitely not just with Europe, right? It's also with the Safavids, with the Indian Ocean, with the Red Sea, et cetera, et cetera. This is, you know, I don't need to belabor the point here, but it's also useful to remind the Europeanists that they cannot treat Europe as a transhistorical category, and that they cannot stand to insist on the relevance of early modernity as a category without recognizing that Europe itself is coming into being through these multiplicity of relationships, and that they ignore these multiplicity of relationships at their own peril, that they cannot really study the West as a transhistorical category. And again, this is about historians debating other historians, but it's very much, to me, also about public discourse and the moment that we live in, and the reentrenchment of these kind of civilizational claims, you know, about you know, the West and bringing democracy to the world, and those other kinds of spurious claims that I think are very much premised on a shrinking of historical time and space, and a certain forgetfulness about how Europe itself comes into being through its multiplicity of relationality. So again, perhaps not something that I think the onus is on the Europeanists more than the Ottomanists, but I think insisting on a category that allows us to think about these relationalities is incredibly important, ethically and politically as much as historiographically.
Thank you, Natalie. And before we go on, does any one of the contributors who haven't spoken so far would like to share their thoughts on any of the issues that have been raised already?
Palmira raised her hand. Palmira raised her hand.
Oh, yes, I missed that. Sorry. Yes, Palmira, please go ahead.
as many of you know, I think that the early modern lasts from the 13th to the late 19th century. And so in some ways, probably Giancarlo and I are affected by some of those Italian influences that take this period, and then maybe you could divide it into the modern and then the really modern. But on the other hand, in some ways, I think Beshara has neatly summarized a lot of the issues that we're facing in his piece in this volume. The question of synchronicity, the assumed synchronicity, whether we want to take that as an essential element, a takeoff point for what we're looking at. I do think the term early modern has been normalized in the field of world history, just as the Ottoman Empire has been normalized in the field of world history. But that said, if we want to focus on the 19th century, which so often happens, to talk about endpoints of the early modern, I agree with Jean-Paul. I think of this question of the early modern and say, well, you know, what do I really want to see here? How do I want to look at the Ottoman Empire in the early modern period? And how do I want to see it divided up? How would I divide it up? And since we've all had it rubbed in our faces the last month, how the United States, for example, is divided up, or how Turkey might be divided up. I'm homeschooling my granddaughter, and we've looked at 10 different maps of the Civil War. And what about those states in the middle? Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, who do they really belong to? So what I would like to see is some kind of a matrix that starts with class first, and then gender, and then age, and then literacy, and apply it to the early modern, to an evolving early modern period, to see who is being transformed and who isn't and how. And I agree with Antonis. I think in some ways, and I'm guilty as charged, I think in some ways we're stuck by this prospect of dealing primarily in the realm of ideas. And sometimes that makes it a little hard. Obviously, we have to go with the sources we've got. And the people who are working on court records often give us material that we don't have otherwise, looking at the realm of ideas. But I do think we have to find ways to transcend that focus on the elite and the literate as we decide how we want to measure the early modern, or how we want to measure the space-time continuum. When I talk to Ginny, she talks about conscription, and I think to myself, well, there it is. If you want to talk about how people are affected, conscription is a pretty dramatic dividing line. But what other kinds of dividing lines might we want to pick and find useful? And that's one of the reasons I find listening to all you guys interesting and nice to see you all.
Thank you, Palmira. Boach raised his hand.
This is actually kind of a not a response, but it's a kind of rejoinder to Palmira. She said, Palmira, you said, you know, it's just early modern normalized in world history, if I remember correctly, and Ottoman history. You know, perhaps not, right? You know, just I know so many colleagues, especially, you know, outside of the United States, who don't find the notion very, very relevant, right? I've been listening to this really stimulating theoretical, largely, conversation, and none of that concerns, you know, the work of many researchers, especially in Turkey, who are involved in producing, generating history, writing history, essentially. So in a sense, you know, what I think, you know, we can ask the question a little bit, what does it mean for us to normalize this term, working largely outside of Turkey, right? How is our understanding and writing Ottoman history different from many colleagues outside of our very provincial environment, right? What kind of questions we are not asking, and what kind of questions are they not interested in that we may be interested in? I think, you know, there's an assumption here, I think, among us, that what the questions that we are asking are relevant or interesting or even encompassing in certain ways that I came to question at this point, right? You know, much of this, what we are hearing, what we seem to be doing, appears to be, for the lack of the better term, and I'm including this into this Beshara said family, is quite, in fact, contextually based, provincial in that sense. And I will count, like, 25 different very close historians working here in Turkey who would find all this discussion completely irrelevant to their work. Should we be bothered by that? At least should we consider, that question as interesting? What does that mean for our field? Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry. I'm concerned that Ginny will raise her talk again.
Thank you, Boğaç. Baki also wanted to say a few words.
I actually found what Boğaç said very interesting, but I would like to hear perhaps a little bit more about what matters in Turkey, because then maybe we could have a more productive conversation about what that might be about. So I'm not going to say more on that. What I wanted to say was something that Marinos mentioned, the sort of infrastructure of all of this. And that is what is missing in our volume, in a sense, socioeconomic history. We don't have that covered. And without that, what we are talking about sort of floats in the air very much. One of the people who registered to attend today was Mehmet Kuru, but I don't see him in the audience. If he were here, he could be very helpful, or somebody like Hülya Canbakal could be very helpful. Mehmet Kuru's dissertation, which I hope will become a book soon, sort of shows that there was a big jump in the trade volume in the late 16th century that happened, international trade. He looks at the custom records, and from there he suggests that there was indeed a very big jump. And then such a big jump did not happen again until perhaps the 19th century. So I think as the global trade grew and the Ottoman trade also grew with it, as there came to be more money with it, clearly there were going to be some changes in socio-political relations. And so I think early modern, we could situate early modern as sort of the follow-up to that big jump. And that, I think, found also its way into a certain degree of capital accumulation, because Hülya Canbakal, in her various presentations of her work, that was a teamwork, well-funded, I think, by the TÜBİTAK, that put together a myriad of records from the sigils for the terekes, etc., people's estate records. If I understood her presentations correctly, in the 18th century, the people whose wealth was recorded were richer than in previous centuries. So probably we also see a capital accumulation happening. But then with the next jump of the 19th century global trade, as I said, the gears changed. So in short, what I'm trying to get at is we are missing the socioeconomic developments of the early modern versus modern here to situate what we are talking about better and safer footing.
Thank you, Baki. And I think this is also relevant on the environmental history side of things as well, and how early modern can be relevant for environmental history, the ways in which economic activities impact the environment, for example, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and how they do in the 19th century with the proliferation of cotton cultivation, for example, so on and so forth. And I see in the audience, Zozan Peklivan, perhaps it would be useful to have that perspective as well. Boğaç raised his hand.
So actually, this is a really good comment, Baki. I totally agree with you that we are, missing some social economic historians. The question is, why are we missing social economic historians? Not many social economic historians want to be part of that discussion. That's one thing, right? We can't immediately think of any social economic historian in the Ottoman context who wants to be part of the conversation about early modernity. If we are talking about capitalism, that would have been a completely different kind of matter, right? But we are not talking about capitalism, despite my Greek colleagues just mentioned. Right? This is, in the Ottoman context, a cultural issue. It's a political issue. It's an intellectual issue. And regarding, trade jumps, I think there is in fact a question about that. Trade jumps happen all the time in history before the rise of capitalism anyways. So certain trade jumps that you are implying are more important than others. A threshold is needed at that point, but we don't know what that threshold is. I think the research that you are mentioning by Giancarlo is a phenomenal one. Incredible research, just came out in Journal of Quantitative History, I think. And what she demonstrates is that there is an increase in wealth accumulation up to a certain point and down, decline of it. I can share with you the article that I looked at relatively recently. So wealth accumulation is not necessarily something that we, if I remember correctly, like you, I take the same caveat with you. And she's very careful not to call this as a threshold, as the beginning of, whatever you call it, modernity or capitalism, essentially. They are really very careful economic historians not to engage, be part of kind of support, these kind of things. Beyond that, whether, such a trade jump happened or not, or whether a certain level of wealth accumulation took place in the 18th century, economic historians are not interested in these questions. And in the Ottoman context, when we are talking about early modernity, we are not necessarily talking about, again, I will have to disagree with my Greek colleagues. We are talking about cultural issues, political issues, intellectual issues, which makes that discussion incredibly provincial. I may be wrong. Okay, I talk too much. I'm sorry.
Thank you much. I think we have unless someone wants to, one of the contributors wants to address any of this. Anir, please.
Yes, unfortunately, I have to go. I have to jump into another meeting. But I did just want to say just one final thought. First, that I'm very grateful for everyone for these contributions. It was a joy to read them when they came out, and again to read them today as I was preparing. I think if you go through them, you'll see just how diverse everyone's views are, and how many still open questions there are actually in this question on the topic of global early modernity. On that note, I want to agree with what Natalie said, which is one thing that I thought I would find in these essays, which I didn't find, which is there is a definition of early modernity and a global early modernity provided by Sanjay Subramaniam and other people that want to do connected history, which is that early modernity is defined by the intensification of connections between different parts of the globe. And from those connections, we can essentially move into different and very specific forms of comparative history, which I think is a useful correction to, or at least to what Marinos has highlighted, which is an overemphasis on synchronicity and coincidence as causal explanations. So I'll just leave it with that. And again, I wanted to agree with Natalie's comments.
Antonis, there's a question in the chat box. Can I read that?
Yes, there's a question. And just to raise another issue on what Baki discussed before and watch about Julia Giancarlo's work, I also wanted to point out to the audience the work by Fokion Gotzaioris and Dimitris Papastamatou, who have doing very similar work on the probate registers of Thessaloniki, studying them across time. And this is, I think it would be very interesting to put this to researchers in dialogue. So we have a question here by Amila Budurovic. Based on Natalie's remarks, I am wondering not just about competing temporalities, but also overlapping temporalities in parts of the Ottoman Empire. I'm thinking specifically of Bosnia, where there is a huge political and ideological consequence for the fate of Bosnian Muslims in the subsequent national awakening of Balkan state. So this is a very relevant discussion since it haunts some of us in real time. Thank you for this comment. Any responses, reactions by the contributors or the audience at large? Beshara Doumani, please.
one way to think about this, I suppose, is of temporality or spatiality, for that matter, as modes of inclusion and exclusion. The way we use them, who do they include, who do they exclude, and why? And I think that she's exactly right about Bosnia. There's huge consequences about zones of visibility or invisibility that are produced by the way we tie these things together. And so there's a political dimension to all of this that's with us all the time.
Thank you. Giancarlo.
Yeah, this is not directly related, but in terms of contemporary relevance, one thing that I have been thinking about very recently is that the sort of the boom of early modern studies was very much a reflection of the sort of moment of globalization, late 90s, early 2000s, and our own experience of living in an interconnected world and seeing that reflected in a kind of a long history of the integration of the globe. And now, you know, we have a very different experience of what that necessarily leads to. So in my particular case, you know, media bubbles is something that would have been very hard to predict 5 or 10 years ago as something that we would be living in and struggling with, how to communicate with people who occupy other media bubbles and how they become sort of perpetuated. And as a result of the integration of our communications ecosystem, and it makes me think differently about some problems in early modern history. So, you know, I think actually what I was dealing with in my essay is a kind of a media bubble. I think Ottoman ulama of the early 17th century they lived in a kind of a media bubble. And so for me, it's very helpful to think about it that way, to resist thinking about that as sort of a vestige of some pre-modern way of thinking about the world, and instead actually a kind of a self-referential system that's being produced as a way to control interconnectivity by sort of systematically ignoring it. So I think that our struggling with this concept of the early modern right now is partly a reflection of how quickly our own current experience of the world is changing.
Could I add something to that?
Of course.
Canada is struggling with this question of the fact that we have 2 Canadians that are locked up in Chinese jails at the moment. And we have the Canadian Parliament has as Trudeau, the government is wanting to pass and work with the United Nations about the 1 million Uyghurs who are locked up on the other side of the world. I think that puts it in a nutshell for me, Giancarlo. 2 humans versus 1 million Uyghurs that are locked up, and we don't know how any longer how to do this kind of intercourse. And that has had a huge impact on the way I've been thinking about my second book, and to what sense the revolutionary age makes a difference to Ottoman history in that context.
A few thoughts that I wanted to share on you know, why perhaps we had this overemphasis on the cultural and the idealist. And I think Giancarlo is correct. I agree with him when he says that the discussion about early modernity was in the 1990s. And this is what I was discussing in my contribution too. What I did not include was the historiographical cycle, as it were, that opened in the 1990s with the cultural turn. And this is perhaps why our contributions were so heavily influenced by those concerns. But what I find particularly interesting is this: right now, this historiographical cycle is coming full circle, and there's renewed interest in economic history, in social history, in environmental history, spatial history, using big data sets, GIS, all these issues which are connected in historiography at large by what is known as new materialism. So I think it would be very interesting to readdress these questions within those settings as well. I see that we have some questions here. Eleni Gara. We should not forget that the notion of early modernity, like that of late antiquity, was coined in order to highlight continuity, in this case between the pre-modern and the modern, instead of rupture. Indeed, an important observation. And then Jesse Howell, I'm curious that no one is mentioning Brodel in this discussion of overlapping temporalities. Thank you, Jesse. Indeed, and that was what I was thinking when I spoke about other special units like the Mediterranean and what Brodel's contribution could bring in, or indeed Hogson, as Vrin Bimbash is pointing out. Any thoughts or reactions by our panelists?
If no one has anything to say, I'd like to just jump on what Eleni just said. I think that is very important. And I believe that is what I tried to do a little bit by looking at religion. And there are people who would talk about this perhaps much better than I could. Derin Terzioğlu or Tiana Kristic, they're not here. Aslıhan is, I think, was here at some point. Maybe she could jump in here as well. But some of the things that happened in this period to the experience of Islam could also very well be thought of a modernization. And this didn't really happen because the Kadızadeli's were following a Western ideal or anything. So some of the developments of the crucial changes in the way Islam was experienced in the public space happened in the 17th century without any sort of sense of, oh my God, we are behind, we need to catch up with the West pressure. So without sort of thinking about these things, the 17th century, the 18th century, as she says, as Eleni says here, the continuity between late modern to our modern times happened through early modern. We, I think, end up inadvertently supporting the idea that the modern experience is just something imposed on us totally by the West. Of course, colonialism and capitalism, those are things that came from Western European experiences. There's no question about that. But the kind of things that we do in terms of responding to them, the resistance to it is also things related to modern experiences. So what I'm trying to get at is, if we leave the discourse, sort of emancipatory discourses that are in some way or another also related to capitalism and colonialism to the West, then we would be losing a whole lot. What I see in Turkey today is sometimes, and I'm not talking about historians, I'm talking about the larger political discourse. The larger political discourse is pushing down on all kinds of emancipatory discourses and trying to sort of replace them with an all-encompassing Ottoman glorious past that somehow we can go back to and then start from there again. So that is why I think a discussion of the early modern has a lot of relevance today, even in Turkey. That's where I'll stop.
There's a new question on the chat box by.
Sorry, yes, my connection was unstable for a second, so I missed the last things that Baki said. So we have a question from Daria Kovaleva to Selim Hoca or anyone else who's interested. Literatures and genres aside, what about the history of language or languages in the early modern empire and beyond? While early modern as a concept proved particularly helpful to illuminate parallel processes in the sphere of culture and different parts of the world, I cannot quite grasp where it has the same analytical power as when it comes to the histories of language.
So Selim has left, I think. He won't be able to answer, but I think
perhaps if Aslıhan is here, she could address this question because she's co-editing a volume with Nir, who has left, on the social history of language.
Hi, everyone. I'm here, and thank you so much for the discussion so far. And I'm one of the co-editors of a forthcoming volume, as Antonis has said, on the history of languages, social history of languages in the Ottoman Empire, in which our contributors engage with language to varying degrees, from zero to completely. But definitely the question of vernaculars and the development of vernaculars for the 19th century, and in a way to challenge the assumption that the vernaculars is a story that begins with nationalist moments, is part of the volume. And we find it as an interesting lens to think not only on early modernity, but to think on early modernity in a connected manner, connected between Muslim and non-Muslim populations, because I think this is one of the links that's missing. We are trying to find a sort of larger framework for connectivity, but the case studies are still mostly focused on individual communities, sort of subcultures and all of that. So for now, all I can say is definitely the interaction between vernaculars and their changing domains is going to be one of the important contributions. I don't know if that answers Daria's question. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to give a full contribution, but I hope we can continue the discussion from this short note.
I think Selim himself actually reflects on this question in his piece, and in fact, he's very critical of the utility of the notion when it comes to literatures and languages. You know, it's a relatively short piece, and you know, he's very clear about that. He's in fact one of the more critical voices about the utility of the notion when it comes to his field. It's really a remarkable piece.
Okay, well, we'll definitely be in dialogue with it.
Thank you both. Victor Ostapchuk would like to say a few words.
Hi, I read all of these papers at their state back in a year ago, or when we had our glow in Vermont, and I've been looked at them now. Just wanted to say one general thing and one specific thing. I'm really surprised that a lot of people were rejecting. I'm surprised we're even talking about a thing called early modernity. As you all know, modern, it's a moving wall. I mean, we started 50 years ago. Early modern wasn't up until the 18th century. Now some people are saying it's still the 19th century. It's a moving wall. It's a useless concept. 500 years from now, we're not going to be talking about an early modern period for this now. We're essentializing something that didn't really exist. I mean, it's sort of, I see it all as kind of magical thinking as opposed to scientific thinking. Or going to think about Hegel or whatever. The thing specifically that I wanted to say is that basic thing you don't have, one of the things that makes our field so special is, people talk about looking at it from materiality, economics. One of the things that makes our field so special are the documents, the Ottoman archives. And in general, looking at it from a documented point of view, I mean, the whole sense of this discussion is to try to look at this period, so-called period, and find various characteristics of it, right? Continuities, connectedness. And if you look at the documents, well, you could talk about preprint and print, manuscript, but also within just looking at the Ottoman archive, looking at it, how it evolved and how it was used. I mean, too bad Heather Ferguson's not here. She could say a few things about this. That would be another interesting aspect of discussing this X period. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Anyone else would like to share their thoughts or raise another issue?
Güneş just raised his hand. Antonis.
Yeah, Güneş, please. Sorry, I missed you.
For Daria's question and Aslan's remark, I would just like to add that perhaps I don't have the same opinion with the irrelevance of the early modernity and the literatures, etc., because I am dealing for some years with the patterns of grammaticalization of the Ottoman language, and there I see some kind of a strange parallel with with some other neighboring languages, although I'm not the expert of them, but I am reading the relevant material, and there is the fixation of the modalities for expressing the future. And there is also the fixation of various forms of the past in the Ottoman Turkish in the 15th or during the late 15th and the 16th century. And it's rather contemporaneous with many other languages, just as French, English, and the Italian. So these time frames fixate at the crucial times where the temporalities have their different or importance in the social life. That's what I would say about the languages or grammatical aspects and the early modernity.
Thank you, Güneş. So yes, I think that if we don't have any more volunteers who would like to say something, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the other two editors. Thank you very much for being here and participating in this discussion and sharing your thoughts and engaging with the ideas that we put forth in this dossier. Would like to thank again the Journal of the Ottoman Turkish Studies Association for hosting the dossier, as well as the Ottoman Turkish Studies Association for organizing this discussion. It was really precious to see all of you and to discuss with everyone. And I'd like to say good night from Europe and good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is in the Atlantic side of things.
Thank you. Thanks, Baki, for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you all. Next month, we're going to have another WhatsApp, and that time we'll be talking with Herman Edney, Caleb Herman Edney, the winner of our Vangelis Kekriotis grant. It will give us a chance to remember Vangelis. Bye.
Bye.